What's the most important date in British history? 1066, the Battle of Hastings? 1666, the Great Fire of London? 1966 then, England win the World Cup? What about 1851? Ring any bells? No? That's because it's one of the most overlooked but most significant moments of all.
This is the summary of the 1851 census, one of those great Victorian State of the Nation surveys. And all the figures here relate to the number of people living in towns and cities as against those living in what it calls the country parts. And the important figure is the figure at the top here, the totals for England and Wales. The number of people living in the country, 8,936,800. Number of people living in towns and cities, 8,990,809. So by a very small margin, about 50,000 or so, there are more urban dwellers than rural dwellers.
1851 was a tipping point, the first time ever that a major nation had become a predominantly urban nation.
And that changed everything. Not just where we lived, but how we lived, what jobs we did, what we thought of ourselves, and most significantly, what we thought about the home that the majority of us had just left and to which we would not return. The countryside.
From that point on, a deeply felt but essentially nostalgic rural vision took hold. The countryside increasingly became a refuge from troubling realities like national decline, world war, and even our own mortality. What we looked for in the countryside was often fanciful, even downright eccentric. But these rural reimaginings acted as a creative catalyst, inspiring some of our most powerful art and best-loved literature.
The idealised vision of the countryside, which emerged in the 19th century, had far more to do with what was going on in the hearts and minds of the exiled and harassed city dwellers than anything that was actually going on out in the shires. But this romantic view of an unspoilt Arcadia, a green and pleasant land, seized the Victorian imagination and has dominated ours ever since.
Each generation has looked to the countryside for different reasons: inspiration, consolation, or escape. Whilst the city propels us into an uncertain future, these green, unspoilt places take our hand and lead us back to a simpler, more stable past. So where can we find the olden days? Right here. In 1862, one of Britain's leading artists decided to escape from the city. Myles Birket Foster came from a family which ran one of the biggest beer bottling companies in the world. But he had more highbrow ambitions and abandoned the family business for the life of an artist. The railway now reached deep into the home counties, and it was Surrey which was to become Birket Foster's muse. He understood what city dwellers needed: a green balm for their weary souls. This is the Merry Harriers in the village of Hambledon. Birket Foster's painting of the pub is one of his best-known works.
In the 19th century, Birket Foster was huge. He was so popular that when Queen Victoria tried to buy a picture she liked at an exhibition, she found it was already sold and the buyer refused to part with it. She loved this stuff, but so did everybody else. And what the Victorians really went for was an idealised, sentimentalised vision of the countryside. This is a classic Birket Foster. It's called The Country Inn, and it was painted in 1863, but it's already set in a receding olden days past. And all the Birket Foster clichés are here. The blue skies, the sunshine, it's always summer in the village, and everyone there is happy and relaxed and well fed. Even the animals are well fed. The horses, the ducks, the chickens, the pigs. Interestingly, there is not a hint of modernity in the picture. The artist has even taken out the road that actually runs in front of the pub. So there are no trains, there are no newfangled steam engines, nothing to disturb the peace and tranquility that the harassed Victorian city dwellers craved.
Birket Foster's paintings, with their antiquated hay wains and apple-cheeked maids, were the latest expression of a very ancient idea in art and literature, the pastoral. The point of the pastoral was to use the countryside to highlight the evils of city living. A rural utopia was contrasted with an urban cesspit of misery and vice. But life out in the sticks wasn't exactly a bed of roses. The tension between illusion and reality can be seen clearly in Oakhurst Cottage in Hambledon, a place Birket Foster painted again and again.
From the census of 1851, we know little about the family that lived in this cottage. The Nalders. The head of the household was William, with his wife Anne and his 3 children, William, Eliza and Harriet. William was a labourer, and we know from farm records that at one point in 1851 he earned 8 shillings from tying truss straws, which means tying up bundles of hay. At another point in 1852 he earned 1 shilling and 4pence for rinsing bark, cleaning oak bark for use in local tanning yards. It looks like he was a seasonal worker, which meant that he was paid piecemeal and in bad times not at all.
Many labourers and their families ended up in the dreaded workhouse. It was a hard life and sometimes a harsh one. Certainly one that was difficult to square with Birket Foster's bucolic idyll. Occasionally, even Birket Foster had to acknowledge reality. Engravings of his paintings were used to illustrate poems by Tom Taylor, a writer and editor of Punch magazine. The cottage homes of England, yes, I know how picturesque their moss and weather stain. All these I know too the plagues that prey on those who dwell in these bepainted bowers, the foul miasma of their crowded rooms. In his poem, Tom Taylor was claiming that thatched cottages were in fact rural slums. For once, Birket Foster's illustrations seemed to confront this poverty. The thatch on the cottages was unkempt. In place of pretty young girls, there was a decrepit older woman. There was even a scythe, a symbol of death and decay.
Birket Foster's old cottages illustrations proved a fleeting brush with reality. For the rest of his career, he kept up the fiction of a rural Arcadia.
The public lapped it up, and rose-tinted images of the countryside, produced by Birket Foster and countless imitators, have been reproduced on calendars, Christmas cards, chocolate boxes and coasters ever since.
But when Birket Foster died in 1899, the Times obituary was a bit more sniffy. It said, from 1860 until the day of his death, his style never varied. His eye saw everything under the same convention, an exquisitely pretty convention, but one remote from all but the superficial and idyllic aspects of nature.
By the end of the 19th century, the real countryside was in crisis, blighted by disease, failed harvests, and above all, cheap imports, which ruined many farmers. People left their villages in increasing numbers. Farmland turned to waste. There was a growing feeling that the natural world itself was under threat. It was against this backdrop that a band of mainly urban and middle-class do-gooders launched the modern conservation movement. A host of different organisations emerged, all dedicated to preserving the rural Olden days in its many forms. Some battled to save Britain's wildest and most beautiful places. Bird lovers turned their attention to our most threatened breeds. Others wanted to conserve not just the countryside, but its ancient architectural treasures. And then there were those who were determined to rescue the culture of the English peasantry itself. The man who spearheaded the folk music revival was the all-singing, all-dancing musician, Cecil Sharp, known, of course, as C Sharp. By the early 20th century, continental composers dominated the classical scene. But Sharp was a fierce patriot. He longed for tunes which would express the genius of the English. In 1903, he heard the song which would inspire a homegrown musical revolution.
He was staying with his friend Charles Marson, who was the vicar of Hambridge in Somerset. And the story goes, he heard the gardener, a man called John England, what a wonderful name for a folk singer to have, singing a song called The Seeds of Love. I sowed the seeds of love, and I sowed them in the spring. I gathered them up in the morning so soon, while the small birds do sweetly sing. While the small birds do sweetly sing. And that day he took the song down, he arranged it and he performed it with a piano that night. And that was really the turning point in a way, because it initiated a period of tremendous activity. Between that period and his death, 1924, he collected about 5,000 pieces.
One morning in the month of June, down by a rolling river, there...
You might expect sentimental conservatives to get misty-eyed about this stuff, but Sharp was very different. He was an austere intellectual, a vegetarian, and a socialist. For him, folk music was the soundtrack to more egalitarian times. Sharp believed peasant songs, as he called them without a hint of self-consciousness, could inspire social change in his own deeply divided age. To find these authentic peasant songs, Sharp travelled round the country, seeking out remote villages, supposedly untouched by modernity.
Sharp's insistence on the purity of his collection of folk songs was potentially problematic, because most of the people from whom he collected the songs had little idea where they got them from. Sharp couldn't be sure of the age of the song, which particular village it came from, or even if it was a genuinely rural song, or one borrowed from the city and then recycled later. Because after 100 years of industrialisation, urbanisation and the spread of the railways, it was open to question whether an uncontaminated rural culture still existed. Perhaps the only place you could be certain of finding an unspoilt English peasant singing his bucolic ballad handed down from generation to generation was in Sharp's own imagination. Sharp and his friends are going out to find this authentic music of old England. What's happening in the modern England at the time?
The days of the Great Exhibition are behind us. Germany and America are overtaking Britain. You know, there's social problems. When it comes to the Boer War, for example, you've got loads of people just unfit to serve because they're not physically fit. So you've got this whole notion of someone going into the towns and the race deteriorating in the towns. A lot of people are worried about the sort of society that's been created by urbanisation and industrialism. So there's a sense in which you can see this folk song, folk dance movement as somehow an attempt to ameliorate that, to give something back to the urban society that's been lost from the rural society. Quite idealistic, but nevertheless something people felt. Ultimately, he believes that it's going to be the material for a sort of cultural regeneration of the country. We're all going to sing these songs and dance these dances, and, you know, it's going to do us good. But I had not the liberty to choose for myself of the flowers that I should wear.
Urban Britain fell in love with Sharp's rediscoveries, and by the early 20th century, the country was in the grip of a huge folk music revival. Sharp's programme of national regeneration was about to receive a huge boost.
There was a frog lived in a well, whipsy-diddly-dandy-dee. There was a...
In 1906, the National Songbook was published for use in elementary schools. The Board of Education had decided that folk music was henceforth to be included in the curriculum. School children, including myself, was still being taught these folk songs as late as the 1960s. The folk revival wasn't just a British phenomenon. Other European countries also looked to the rural past for the things which they felt made them unique. All this dressing up looked harmless enough, but it was one sign of a spirit of aggressive nationalism which contributed to the outbreak of war in 1914. In Britain, the countryside proved to be a potent recruitment tool. More than 12 million posters were issued in the first 2 years of the war, and many featured heartwarming vistas. An idealised landscape of rolling hills and thatched cottages reminded people of what was at stake. This rural propaganda worked, even though many recruits had never seen a thatched cottage in their lives. No matter, this was the heart and soul of the whole nation, and even kilted Highlanders agreed. The landscape of the Western Front was very different. Traumatised soldiers couldn't have felt further from home. No wonder the Olden days looked appealing by comparison. One of Cecil Sharp's legacies, alongside the revival of folk music, was the rediscovery of folk dance. Sharp had become a world expert. Here he is in a film from 1912, cutting a caper in his three-piece suit, although his half-poussettes and hands four weren't always perfectly executed. For its aficionados, Morris dancing was the artistic expression of what was known as Merry England, a mythical medieval golden age when life was a lot jollier. For people disturbed by the tragic unravelling of the 20th century, Merry England was a symbol of everything that their own age wasn't. One of the most ardent advocates of Merry England was folk dance teacher Daisy Daking, who was described by one contemporary as London-born, deadly efficient, 3 feet high. In 1917, Miss Dakin set off for northern France on a special assignment: to rehabilitate wounded and war-weary soldiers through Morris dancing.
In Daisy Dakin's mind, there was a certain amount of wishful thinking. She imagined that most of the soldiers were country lads, ploughboys in khaki, whereas in fact, most of them came from towns and cities. They were more familiar with the music hall than the maypole. Their favourite songs were foreign imports, American hits like Down Home in Tennessee, rather than traditional English folk songs like Jenny Pluck Pears or Gathering Peascods. Many of them wouldn't have known what a peascod was, but Daisy Dakin was on a mission. It is their own folk art, she said. Though they may not know it, it is in their blood. And she was determined that they would learn to love Morris dancing.
The first Morris dances were not a great success. The men were too shy to join in. Miss Dakin, however, had a solution. Remember to dig out the Australians first, as they're always ready for anything, she said. Pair them off with any Scots, as these are born dancers. An eyewitness described one of Dakin's classes. The dancers are none of them clumsy. On the contrary, considering the weight of their thick-soled boots, they're remarkably light on their feet. The popularity of these dances is accounted for by the fact that the movement and rhythm were evolved by their fathers and are native to men of their race.
Morris dancing in the middle of a war seems ludicrous. And Daisy Dakin was perfectly aware of this. She said that when she first tried to introduce it, people told her she was being somewhat silly. There was Miss Dakin telling war-weary troops that this dance dates back to 1650, the time of Merry England, or asking them to imagine that they were on a village green back in Blighty, rather than in a hut on the Western Front. But it worked. As a reminder of an idealised home, as a wholesome communal activity, or just as a distraction from the horrors of war, Morris dancing caught on. And the soldiers were very grateful. Here's a beautiful tribute to Daisy Dakin from some of those who'd taken part. It says to Daisy Dakin, from friends who keenly appreciate your successful efforts to arouse deep interest in English folk dancing. And then there's a list of names: the Atkinsons, the Donnellys, the Flemings, the Macintoshes, the Robertsons. So it goes on. At one stage, 100 men a day were passing through her classes. And these are men who were suffering from shell shock and depression. Her verdict on the effect she could have was typically modest. She said, "We got the grey look off their faces."
During the Great War, the countryside was a place of psychological refuge for soldiers. So, when the troops returned home, it was a cleaner, greener future that they longed for. What many of them aspired to was a home in the leafy suburbs. To accommodate their dreams, the biggest house-building programme in British history began. Birmingham's experience was typical of what happened to many cities. Between the wars, more than 100,000 homes were built there. But for a new suburban utopia to be born, an old rural one had to die. For the writer J.R.R. Tolkien, nowhere was more beloved than Sarehole. In the early 20th century, it was a village several miles outside Birmingham. Tolkien dramatised the fate which befell Sarehole. The story of this Warwickshire village spawned one of the most successful literary and film franchises of all time. Tolkien was born in South Africa in 1892. He arrived in Sarehole on a family holiday when he was 3 years old. But after the sudden death of his father, the family settled in the village. The character and virtues of the stout-hearted Warwickshire country folk left a lasting impression. I was brought up in considerable poverty, but I was happy running about in that country, Tolkien wrote. I took the idea of the hobbits from the village people and children. In the middle of Sarehole was an old mill. Tolkien and his younger brother were fascinated by it and would sneak in to watch the wheels turn. Tolkien nicknamed the grumpy miller the White Ogre because he was often covered in what appeared to be flour.
Tolkien only lived here for 4 years, but he called it the longest seeming and most formative part of my life. Sarehole became emblematic of everything about England that the child had fallen in love with. He described it as a sort of lost paradise.
In 1904, this idyllic childhood was cut short when Tolkien's mother died. He was 12 years old and an orphan. He had to leave Sarehole and move into a succession of grim boarding houses in Birmingham. Tolkien didn't return for many years, and when he did, he was devastated. In his diary, he wrote, "Where the Bluebell Lane ran down into the Mill Lane is now a dangerous crossing, alive with motors and red lights. How I envy those whose precious early scenery has not been exposed to such violent and peculiarly hideous change." Tolkien cautioned against reading messages into his novels, but it's almost impossible not to see allusions to the land of his lost youth. At the heart of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings is the Shire, a haven of rural contentment reminiscent of Sarehole. Threatening it is Mordor, a wasteland of furnaces and factories. Birmingham by any other name.
Life is often more complex than myth, and the actual history of Tolkien's beloved mill is less romantic than he painted it. The white powder he remembered covering the miller may not necessarily have been flour from corn. The mill was much used at the time for grinding animal bones to make fertiliser. Before that, in the 19th century, the natural power of the water wheel was supplemented by an industrial steam engine. And before that, in the mid-18th century, the mill was used as a metal bashing shop, set up by Matthew Boulton, one of the fathers of the Industrial Revolution. So for much of its working life, the mill that inspired the olden days Shire was in fact an outpost of modernising Mordor.
By the mid-1930s, Mordor was marching right across the British countryside. Pylons sprang up across the shires. An expanding road network crisscrossed the nation. Vehicles swarmed uphill and down dale. With the advent of modernity in the shape of the motor car, might the rural olden days finally become irrelevant? 1930s, automobiles offered independence, freedom and adventure. The increasingly large number of people taking to the roads were part of a new generation of more affluent suburbanites, easily mocked because of their comfortable lifestyles and bland tastes, but actually hankering for something more exciting and more adventurous than the golf course or the tennis club. These British explorers got into their new cars, drove out of the present and into the past. Motoring guides were published to direct the wanderlust of the mobile middle classes. The most famous were the Shell guides, sponsored by the Shell Oil Company. The poet John Betjeman was the editor. The artist John Piper wrote and illustrated a number of the guides. Piper had made his name in the early 1930s as one of Britain's leading avant-garde painters. Having been lured to Paris, Piper had fallen for abstract art and European modernism. But the new modern world was now transforming the old British landscape. And as it did so, Piper, who was a country lad at heart, found himself increasingly attracted to rural themes, like manor houses and village churches. Perhaps only Britain could produce an arch-modernist who was in love with the olden days. In the Shell guides, these old and new aspects of Piper's artistic persona fused creatively.
Shell guides didn't tell you to go and see the obvious sights. So don't just go and see Salisbury Cathedral or Bath Abbey. Go and look at the things that are, first of all, unusual and romantic, but most importantly, and you'll see it all through these books, the things that are decaying and disappearing. His book, here it is, Oxfordshire, by John Piper, he talks about a county of magnificent ruins, and that's what he really wants to show you. It's all about texture, feeling. It's not just about architecture itself, it's about a sensibility. Every page of a publication should be a surprise, said Piper, said Betjeman. That's the world they belonged to and they loved. One of the first images you see as you open Oxfordshire is a
wall full of dead birds.
A wall full of dead birds. It's like something out of Hitchcock, isn't it? These are obviously dead crows and rooks hung up to scare away rooks and crows from destroying fields and their crops. But it's the idea of an image that's meant to make you jump. It's not the roses over the traditional sweet thatched English cottage. It's dead birds. Remember, these books are a meditation on things passing.
It's a slightly melancholy sensibility, isn't it? It's a loss pervades.
This England that you look through now in these books is basically gone. There's not a village here where you can drive through now that hasn't got yellow lines and curbs and signs everywhere, and where the nice old rustic pubs full of farmers are now gastropubs.
As the pace of change quickened in the late 1930s, Piper's attention was drawn to the very olden days, to manifestations of permanence in an increasingly volatile world. One Oxfordshire monument in particular gripped his imagination.
Piper devotes an unusually large entry to the Rollright stones, along with a full-page illustration. He writes, "A prehistoric stone circle, after Stonehenge and Avebury, the most celebrated in England." As a modernist, the abstract shapes of these weathered stones clearly appealed, as did the fact that they overlooked these extraordinary views over the heart of England. But the date of publication of this guide, 1938, gives a clue as to what else might have been of such special interest. Disturbing events in Europe meant that he was already moving away from an international ideological style and trying to find something more native, more essentially English. And these ancient British stones became a sort of symbol of the continuity and stability of British history. In fact, I think it's true of the Shell Guides as a whole, which became a repository, a storehouse of treasures of national identity.
With the outbreak of war, national survival became the main concern. Artistic inspiration was important, but what Britain really needed from the countryside was something more prosaic: food. Today, the farms of Britain are the front line of freedom, Winston Churchill declared. With the help of the 80,000-strong Women's Land Army, moors and meadows were unsentimentally ploughed up. And this was only the first step in a modernising revolution. If there's one time in particular when we turned our back on the past, then it was after the war, in the late 1940s and 50s. Britain looked to the future with optimism. Science and technology would shape a new age. This was no time to be nostalgic about the rural past. The countryside had to become more productive, less pastoral, more industrial. But the challenge was to make agricultural improvement exciting.
In 1948, a group of farmers, men from the Ministry of Agriculture and BBC producers, met in Birmingham. And it was at this meeting that one of the farmers suggested that what the countryside needed was a farming Dick Barton. Dick Barton was a fictional special agent whose radio adventures attracted a regular audience of 15 million listeners. So everyone at the meeting burst out laughing. What a ludicrous idea, a farming Dick Barton. Except the BBC producers, who decided they liked the idea of making life in the countryside dramatic. The programme they went on to develop soon eclipsed Dick Barton and became one of the most successful radio programmes of all time.
Subtitled An Everyday Story of Country Folk, The Archers is set in the fictional village of Ambridge. The original idea was to seed each episode with cutting-edge farming advice. Here, go-getting Dan Archer, his wife Doris, and his stuck-in-the-mud farmhand Simon talk about how to modernise egg production.
We can get the battery house shifted up here quick as you like. You need 3 square feet per bird for the best result.
What's Chris getting for you?
Some spectacles for the hens.
Eh?
Yes, spectacles for the hens.
Oh.
One or two of them have started pulling each other's feathers out.
I don't know, Mrs. First, Christine wants to give them electric light at night so as they can read in bed. And now Gaffer's providing them with spectacles so as they won't strain their eyes. I don't know what farming's coming to, that I don't.
The Archers may have begun life as a way of promoting intensive farming, but what it stands for has changed over time. Nowadays, it isn't an advocate of modernity. Arguably, it's become a refuge from it.
Do you know?
So, Ian, welcome to Ambridge.
This is it.
This is it.
I am privileged.
Is Ambridge.
Oh, is this is a cottage door, is it?
Yes, many a door.
That's
very
good, isn't
you
it?
have a job.
Up to 5 million people still visit Ambridge each week. For many, it's their only regular encounter with rural life.
What's that, then?
This is old recording tape, which...
What's it meant to be?
We use it for straw.
Oh, you're kidding.
If you kind of spread it on the floor a bit, if you're in a barn or something with the cows, it's just got that nice crunch to it.
Brilliant. And what else have we got?
In the Archers' studio, modern technology is harnessed to a very old idea of the countryside as the place of escape. The green hills of Borsetshire are a soothing contrast to the grey cities where most people live.
If we've got scenes, for example, where we've got people at the top of Lakey Hill and somebody needs to run all the way down to the bottom,
Yeah.
they can run off, and if I run off, and I'm getting further and further away, and hopefully I've now reached the very bottom of Lakey Hill. I'm absolutely miles away.
Yeah, you sound miles away.
And I'm just going to run back very fast, all the way up the hill, and I'm just coming back now, and I'm hardly out of breath, but I have just run all the way to the bottom of Lakey Hill.
That is absolutely brilliant.
It's a trick of the acoustics and the design of the studio that I can go a very short distance but sound miles away.
I feel here that I am literally in the heart of the countryside, but I'm in the middle of Birmingham.
Yeah, quite.
Agricultural innovation does still rear its head in Ambridge, but these days change doesn't necessarily mean progress. Take Debbie Aldridge, for example. Her newfangled farming schemes are causing quite a stir.
The first thing I wanted to ask was the plans for the mega dairy. I mean, how can you possibly have been behind that?
I think the very important thing to remember is that Debbie Aldridge is a character.
Oh, is that right?
And I am an actor who plays her. So
you don't really approve of putting all those cattle in a big factory?
Well, I don't know anything about it.
Right. But if you listen to the Archers, and staggering numbers of people do, yes, it's full of sort of oddities and odd members of the family, but there's something that makes the Archers still stick together. It sort of works, doesn't it, as a group of people who vaguely function?
You've got fantastic characters, but more than that, you've got people who talk to one another. And I think generally we don't have those sorts of conversations in life, do we? We send a text, or I'll ping off an email to you.
Yeah.
And we don't write letters, we don't pick up the telephone, but in the Archers, they really do pick up the telephone a lot.
Yes, and they sit down with a cup of tea a lot.
With a cup of tea, there's less and less interaction. So maybe there's a fondness for that, the longing for those times of when you could just say to someone, how are you doing, and expect some sort of coherent response.
Yes.
But that sort of is a lovely reflection of us as human beings, that, you may have, as you do, 5,000 Facebook friends and, 20 million Twitter followers.
I'm not on Twitter.
As you do. The reality is that we can probably
and no
hold...
friends either.
Yeah, but I knew that. We can probably hold about 20 people in our circle of realistic relationships. And so the Archers reflects that very well. And, we have very shallow, very narrow relationships, really, that are techno-based.
Yeah.
And we don't sit down and, have a cup of tea.
And is it that
so
they
nice
also
to talk
have...
to you.
Yeah, it is lovely to talk to you. And I've got time, you see.
With over 17,000 episodes and counting, The Archers is the longest-running radio soap opera in the world. And perhaps the reason for its continuing popularity is not the occasionally sensational introduction of modernity into Ambridge in the shape of drug abuse or gay marriage, but precisely the reverse. Because Ambridge is still a reassuringly cohesive rural community which gets together at the pub, at the Bull, in church at St Stephen's, or in Linda Snell's Christmas pantomimes. This is still a place where the passing of the year is marked by the seasons, and where the flower and produce show is still at the centre of village life. Although The Archers was originally aimed at farmers, the BBC always wanted to appeal to what it quaintly called the townsman. So, 6 times a week, the countryside recolonises the city through the medium of radio. And the noise and the hubbub of the traffic is replaced by the calming bleat of sheep and the comforting lowing of cattle. In the early days, the Archers showcased bigger fields, labour-saving machines, and more chemicals. What happened in Borsetshire happened in real counties up and down the land. Hedgerows were grubbed up, ancient woodlands were chopped down. By the 1960s, people began to fear that the countryside had changed too much. This was when the word environment acquired a new meaning. No longer something which was all around us, but something fragile, which might disappear for good. the early 1970s, a government committee was set up to investigate the relationship between man and the environment. The great and the good, who sat on the committee, decided they wanted some poetry to preface their report. So they commissioned Hull-based poet Philip Larkin to write something suitably elevating. If they were hoping for a bland official statement in verse, they'd come to the wrong man.
What did he look like?
Eric Morecambe. Balding, big glasses, but without that twinkle and that grin that Morecambe had.
So a sort of deadpan version?
Absolutely.
In person, Larkin was quite rooted in olden days, wasn't he?
He certainly was. I mean, you know, he was a tweed jacket man. He wore a tie. He liked traditional jazz. He didn't like rock music. The public persona was very olden days when every now and then there were television programmes made about him, and he did absolutely sort of project this image of, you know, the slightly curmudgeonly old gent.
Larkin had moved to Hull to work as a university librarian. What attracted him to the city was its isolation, its end-of-the-line feel. He wrote, "Deprivation is for me what daffodils were for Wordsworth." His poetry is both melancholic and truthful. So the poem he wrote as a preface to the government report, which he later called Going, Going, is a sort of fierce elegy, a grumpy lament for the destruction of the English countryside.
I thought it would last my time. The sense that beyond the town there would always be fields and farms where the village louts could climb such trees as were not cut down. I knew there'd be false alarms in the papers about old streets and split-level shopping, but some have always been left so far. And when the old part retreats, as the bleak high-rises come, we can always escape in the car.
The central image of the poem is that England, this valuable, ancient thing, the English countryside, is being auctioned off, going, and it will be gone, sold to the highest bidder. That sense of the countryside as something that's been there since time immemorial, that we've imagined will always be there. But now suddenly he's imagining what will England be like when the countryside is gone. Great moment in the poem where he said, we've always assumed that the earth can take it, that whatever we do, the earth, the sea will endure. But now all of a sudden he's thinking, whoa, too much.
Larkin loved graveyards. He was a man who liked to dwell on his own mortality. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, his meditation on the destruction of the countryside in Going, Going led him to ponder extinction of a more personal kind.
In the middle of the poem, Larkin asks a question which goes to the heart of our relationship with the past and the present. What do I feel now, he wonders. Doubt or age, simply? The crowd is young in the M1 cafe. He's essentially examining his own responses. Is the country really going to the dogs, or am I just getting old? It's typically honest, and in its gloomy way, rather profound, because what he's suggesting is that our nostalgic yearning for an unspoilt rural past has less to do with what's going on out there in the farms and the fields, and more to do with what's going on in here, with our own insecurities and fragile sense of self.
What we are frightened of, he seems to be saying, is not just that the countryside is going, going, but that we are.
It seems, just now, to be happening so very fast. Despite all the land left free, for the first time, I feel somehow that it isn't going to last. That before I snuff it, the whole boiling will be bricked in except for the tourist parts. First slum of Europe. A role it won't be so hard to win with a cast of crooks and tarts. And that will be England gone. The shadows, the meadows, the lanes, the guild halls, the carved choirs. There'll be books. It will linger on in galleries. But all that remains for us will be concrete and tires.
The government committee didn't like the poem's rude remarks about crooks and tarts. But its theme was hugely resonant in a new era of uncertainty. Post-war Britain had dreamt of a new Jerusalem, but this had turned into economic woe and social upheaval.
People reacted to the unnerving scale of change, as they so often do, by reaching back into the past and clinging on to symbols of continuity and stability, however paradoxical those symbols might be. Take, for example, this great edifice here, the Headstone Viaduct in Monsall Dale, at the heart of Derbyshire's Peak District. When Larkin was writing his poem, the railway line that used to go through this valley was closed down, yet there was a vociferous and successful campaign to preserve the viaduct. It's old and weathered-looking and seems venerable, and you can see it aroused affection. But when it was actually built 150 years ago, it was a completely different story. Then, Victorian conservationists turned it into a national cause célèbre. They were incensed at the desecration of this rural idyll and the intrusion into it of what they saw as a symbol of hateful modernity.
The most outspoken conservationist was the art critic John Ruskin. For Ruskin, the railway epitomised a brutalising age. It drove its way through the heart of ancient towns and blighted the countryside.
In 1871, Ruskin wrote a furious diatribe against the building of the railway. There was a rocky valley between Buxton and Bakewell, once upon a time, divine as the Vale of Tempe. That was in ancient Greece in the very, very olden days. And apparently there you could see gods like Pan and Apollo and the Muses. Anyway, Ruskin continues, "You enterprised a railroad through the valley. You blasted its rocks away, heaped thousands of tons of shale into its lovely stream. The valley is gone, and the gods with it. And now every fool in Buxton can be in Bakewell in half an hour, and every fool in Bakewell at Buxton, which you think a lucrative process of exchange. You fools everywhere." Quite harsh.
150 years on, the image of the viaduct has undergone a remarkable transformation. Now it's seen as a positive addition to the landscape, an olden days attraction in its own right.
They reopened the tunnels a couple of years ago so that cyclists, horse riders and walkers could come through. And it makes for a terrific walk, and it's immensely popular. I mean, people come to the Peak District for all sorts of reasons, but this is a big draw. And in the summer, bank holidays, it's almost crowded.
Why do you think people come? What are they getting out of seeing this?
Well, it's just a fantastic walk. You go into the tunnel at the other side. You can't see the way out because it's curved, so it's a mystery. And you come out and wow, we're on top of a bridge looking down on the river in this beautiful scenery. I mean, it's exciting, it's wonderful.
When you look at this viaduct, it's quite pretty, but not very pretty, is it? Why do you think people have got so attached to it?
Well, because they've got used to it being here. It's like the trees, it's part of the landscape.
Now, you're a serious rambler. So when people are walking, you take to the countryside. What is it you're looking for?
You look around this landscape and it's not a wilderness. It's been used for hundreds and thousands of years. So what we're looking at is the sum total of people's use of this countryside. So it's not natural, and this is just part of that use. But we've got thin cop up over there, which is a Neolithic site. There's a weir in the river, which was used for fishing. There's the farms over there, the limestone slopes, which are grazed, and that's what makes the wildlife so wonderful, the limestone flowers. And the footpaths that we use, of course, they're the routes that people used to use to get to work, to get to church, to get to school, to get to market. So just the footpaths are part of the historical nature of the landscape. And that's what the charm is for me.
If Ruskin's eyesore can become a rambler's delight, then who knows what modern monstrosities we may end up treasuring in the future. Wind farms, perhaps, even fracking sites. Despite the fact that it is constantly changing, the countryside has been for us a symbol of changelessness. A lost Arcadia, a lost childhood, a lost home.
I grew up living abroad, frequently on the move with my mother and father, and the landscapes of my youth were exotic: Africa, Saudi Arabia, and Hong Kong. But this, Sussex, is what we always thought of as home, which was odd really, because my father came from Scotland and my mother from the Channel Islands, but they decided to move here and buy a house which we always kept as our link to Britain. We used to come up here to Devil's Dyke for picnics when I was a child. So this very gentle, very English countryside is a link to the past, not just for me, but for everyone, because they've recently turned it into a national park. And that desire to conserve a much-loved area makes me realise again that the countryside in Britain is a sort of physical embodiment of the olden days. It's a green portal through which we can go to a world which is somehow more peaceful, simpler, and better than the complex one in which we actually live. I chose the term the olden days for this series deliberately because it's often used pejoratively. Oh, the olden days. Dwelling on the past can be seen as a regressive and slightly absurd national trait. Nostalgia has been considered a British disease, and we can be too easily caricatured as a nation who would like to turn its entire history into a series of commemorative tea towels. But I think the olden days is better than that. Yes, the facts are a bit dodgy, and the great characters and traditions more or less invented, and the countryside over-sentimentalised. But the concept is still important, because at the very least it offers an escape from the confines of the present, which shouldn't be underestimated. And at best, it gives us a way to use the past to criticise the present and make the future better. So, if we're very lucky, in a couple of hundred years, someone will look back at us and find something of merit in what we've done, and we'll call our times the olden days.